You know, a number of you, and I think women often get started by telling our own stories, and I was really happy to hear Jen's story as to how she got active, and Paula's as well. I got my start when I became a single parent. My son was 7, and I found myself pounding the pavement looking for a job in a difficult job market. And I found myself in front of a Dunkin' Donuts, so I went in for an interview, and the manager said to me, "Oh, you Chinese are good workers, aren't you?" So I said, so, very good. Because I really needed that job. But that was the moment for me that a little light bulb went off, and I thought, you know what? I'm going to be expected to work harder for less than the white women who are doing this fabulous work of counter girl at the Dunkin' Donuts. Well, a few months into the job, the cash register came up $24 short, and we were each docked $6 in our pay. There were 4 of us, so we each got docked $6. And I was really pissed, if you'll pardon my French. And I decided that I was not just going to stay angry, but I was going to get even, as they say. And I found out that there was a law that said they cannot do that. And so I filed a suit against the Dunkin' Donuts manager, and I got my $6 back. Made me realize was that there were many people before me in the labor movement who had organized, who had struggled, who had fought, who had sacrificed in order to make that rule so that I could have my day of triumph. And it made me want to be on the side of those advocates who make policies, who make things better for people in the future. And as Jen said, once you get started, why stop? So that's how I got started. Now, how many of you have heard of the string theory in physics? Anybody? Oh, a number of you. Well, I have to say I've heard of it a number of times, and I still can't tell you exactly what it means. But when I heard about it, it made a lot of sense to me because as a person of color growing up in this society, you know what? This is not, oh, sorry. It's not advancing? Oh, never mind. Here we go. We already knew that there were parallel universes because the same rules do not seem to apply to communities of color as they do to white communities. And that is true for children as well, of course. And in Paula's fabulous, by the way, video there, she talked about the pathways for children. The question is, are we going to grow up together, or are we going to face diverging pathways? And unfortunately, right now, there are diverging pathways, and not all children are on that same path to opportunity that Paula talked about. So let's just look at a couple of things, and this comes from the Annie E. Casey Foundation report, Race for Results, and I'm sure many of you use Kids Count, but this is a supplement to it that breaks the data down by race and by state, again, as usual. So you know some of this, so I'll just go through it quickly. But even at the point of birth, African Americans are more likely to have low birth weight babies than white families. There's a 5% difference there. By the 4th grade, again, we see these disparities developing. African American children, only 17% scored at or above proficiency levels compared to 22% of Native American, 19% Latino, white 45%, and Asian Pacific Islanders 51%. When you get to early adulthood, again you see these disparities in terms of young folks who have an associate's degree or higher. It ranges from only 19% of American Indians and to Asian Pacific Islanders at 66%. With every single group, we could do better. Now, the other thing, though, and we often think the solution is education, but even with education, we see disparities. So that for the unemployment rate among college graduates, again, you see that the black unemployment rate is twice that of whites. So in almost every measure, the African Americans tend to have twice as difficult a time getting a job or being in poverty or whatever. And of course, if you have no job and you are not in school, that's going to lead to trouble. And the incarceration rates, as you all know, in this society are really unconscionable, and that is something that we need to take a strong look at. Now, in terms of Washington State specifically, in terms of the Annie Casey report, it found that you do the worst when it comes to Latino kids. Their score out of a possible 1,000 on 12 different indicators of success, Latinos only scored 377 in the state, which is below the national average. On the other groups, Native American, African American, white, and Asian, you did score higher. The highest group in the state was Asian Pacific Islanders at 760. However, I just want to remind you that that doesn't mean that all Asian Pacific Islanders are doing well. We have the strangest economic profile as opposed to either a pyramid or kind of a bell-shaped curve. We are an hourglass, so that Chinese and Asian Indians tend to be at that top, but there are many at the bottom. The Hmong have the highest rates of poverty than any racial or ethnic group in the country. So we need more disaggregation of the data. So as we look at these numbers, you know, we want to know not just that these disparities exist, but why do they exist? And many of you have a lot of ideas, and we do know a number of the factors that, that are a part of the reason for the disparities. But I wanted to talk to you today and to get you to think a little bit about the issue of wealth. Children are the wealth of the nation, but they also require some wealth in order to get them onto that path to opportunity. And when we think about how people are doing economically, we always think of income, but we rarely think about wealth, although I'm hoping that that is starting to change due to some of the work that's going on. Now, the way that wealth was described by W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the African-American thinker and activist at the turn of the last century, who said that the biggest issue of the 20th century was the color line, and I'm afraid to say that that's still the biggest issue that we're facing today. But he talked to an agricultural audience, many farmers in his community, and he said that you have to think about having 3 ears of corn. You had to have 1 corn to eat, 1 corn to sell, and 1 ear of corn for tomorrow's planting, next year's planting. Well, that 1 to eat is your expenses, the 1 to sell is your income, but the 1 for next year's planting is wealth. And the first form of wealth is savings, and many people don't have any savings at all. In fact, many people have what is known as negative wealth or debt. So savings is something that our whole country has gotten very poor at. But what is the importance of wealth? So here's that corn. First of all, it's economic security. So as we found out during this last recession, you know, people who lost their job, they had nothing to fall back on. So you need to have a little nest egg or something that will tide you over those difficult times that are inevitable in everybody's life. Second, wealth gives you opportunity. It determines where you live, where you go to school, and even what kind of health care you can get. You know, so much of what we know about children is dependent on their zip code. They say you can predict a person's health more by their zip code than by any other factor. Wealth is also something that accumulates. You can do nothing with that money, and it will just increase in value. So that's a fabulous thing about wealth. And most important for us is that wealth is something that can be paid forward. You don't need a lot, and I'm not talking about people being wealthy. I'm just talking about having even a small amount that you can pass on to your kids to give them that head start. So for example, if you have $10,000 to give them in their lifetime to go to college, that's a huge step forward. So many people, young people, are dropping out of school because they can't afford the tuition rates. Or they might use that for a down payment on a home. So those things we call transformational assets, and definitely are things that can improve our children's future. In the asset building world, we like to say that income allows you to get by, but it is wealth that allows you to get ahead. So, what is the story, though, of how we become wealthy? Everybody wants to have that savings. Everybody would like to be economically secure and be able to pass something on to their children. But what is it that allows people to become wealthy or to have assets? Well, the usual story is that it's hard work. If you work really hard, and then you save, you're going to be able to be wealthy. Well, one of the first people who got quite wealthy, in fact, became a millionaire at the turn of the last century was John Paul Getty. Do you all know who he was? Getty gas station. So, of course, everybody wanted to know the secret of his success. And he said, and he was very open about his situation. He said, sure, I'll tell you my secrets. The first thing is you have to work hard. Okay, everybody, you can work hard. They said, okay, we can do that. And the second thing he said was, you have to rise early. Okay, a little harder, but I can rise early. And the last thing he said was, find oil. So that's a little bit harder to do. But the one thing that he did not talk about and that nobody thought to ask about was, how did he get the right to that land on which the oil was found? So let's now take a look at the real story of wealth from the point of view of some of those that live in these parallel universes. So when the first colonists got to this land that was to become the United States, it was already populated, very densely populated, actually, fairly densely populated by Native American people. And here we had a real clash of cultures because Native Americans don't think of wealth as accumulation, as I put in that one slide. They think of it as stewardship, and that the real wealth of the country is in the land and in the natural resources. Therefore, it is the job of everyone to steward those resources so that they will continue to be there 7 generations hence. That was not the point of view of the colonists, though. They thought that land was to be held privately for short-term profit. You fence it off, you say nobody can come on this land, and you make a profit off of it. Those two ideas totally clashed, and unfortunately, the result was that the European colonists got the land and the Native Americans lost it. And I was going to say that it isn't just Native Americans, though, that have that view of land and wealth. It is in almost every religious tradition. So, for example, in the Jewish faith, there was, in the Bible, it talks about leaving part of the field ungleaned, that there should be something left over for poor people to come and have something, so that it's not like one person should have everything and everybody else should have nothing. In the Christian faith as well, we have the Jubilee year, so that while things are distributed and people can make their profits and so on for a certain length of time, that land gets redistributed again after 50 years so that everybody gets a chance to start again, because people did not invent land and resources. It's not something we made. So how can anybody lay a claim to it? And the foundation of just about anything is land and natural resources. You can't make anything, including computers, as you do here so well in Seattle, without those natural resources. So the result for Native Americans is that over time they lost their biggest source of wealth, which was the land. And by 1890, our country looks very much the way it is now. There are certain reservation lands, but even those reservation lands were not controlled by the Native people. They were controlled by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and not managed to the benefit of the Native Americans. So now that's one of the reasons we see the poverty rates among the Native Americans that we see. So theft of the land was the one way that we saw a big transfer of wealth from Native American peoples to the white colonists. For African Americans, and that's the story we know better, there was a theft not of their land, but of their labor, but also of their very humanity. So that not only were African Americans not allowed to own any wealth, they were not even allowed to earn an income, and in fact, they were someone else's wealth. So the southern states were the richest states before the revolution and after for some time until the Civil War. But most of their wealth was held in the form of people, in the form of enslaved people. At that time, for example, half of all of the people in Georgia were enslaved, and they were the wealth of someone else. So if we think about that idea that hard work is the reason that people get wealth, if that were true, the African American community should be the wealthiest community in our country today. It has been estimated that if they had only been allowed to earn an income, there would be $1 trillion more flowing in the black community, and can you imagine what a different society we would have? For Latinos, it was a little bit different. Do you all know that song that we all sang in grade school, and perhaps they still do, America the Beautiful, Oh Beautiful for Spacious Skies? You all know that one? So in that song, which I always brought tears to my eyes, it ends with, America, America, God shed his grace on thee, and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. Well, it turns out that that beautiful little song is a song of manifest destiny. It was the view that God had given the United States the right to expand from one ocean to the other, no matter what stood in the way. And in fact, what stood in the way was Mexico. Mexico owned most of the southwest of the United States, California, Colorado, and so on. And we trumped up a war with Mexico in order to get that land. It was such a ridiculous war that some of the Irish who fought in that war actually joined the side of the Mexicans because they realized it was so unjust. But we trounced the Mexicans and took, in 1865 at the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, we took most of that land. So for many of the Latinos who try to go back and forth across the border, you know that saying, I didn't cross the border crossed me. So you could be on the same piece of land, and one day you're living in Mexico, and the next day you were living in Texas and part of the United States. So that was the foreign policy was the way that we were able to, the Anglos were able to get land from the Mexicans. And in fact, then we started to see these bracero programs, guest worker programs, which we still have, which says that you can come into our country to work, but then you have to leave again. You have no right to citizenship. And many of you, I believe you may have changed this, but the right of the children, American-born children of immigrant workers to go to college on, at the state rates. But it's interesting that we now call them guest workers. I'm thinking, like, is this the way you would treat a guest? Invite them to your house, do all the housework, and tell them to leave out of the back door? I don't think so. So a lot of euphemisms going on here. Now, with the Asian population, it's probably one of the clearest examples of how race is a socially constructed term. So take a look at this passport. It is from Patrick O'Malley and his wife. And the race is listed as colored. So, you know, back at this time, it's dated 1884, the date of their marriage. At that time, nobody really knew what color, what races people were. So for the Chinese who came here during the gold rush, the same as many other European immigrants in order to find gold, they didn't understand why they couldn't be citizens. In 1790, there was a Naturalization Act passed, and it said you had to work hard, again, work hard, and we could do that. You had to be upstanding citizens, could do that. Had to live in the country for 2 years, could do that. And you had to be white. Well, for the Chinese, they thought, well, we think we could do that too. So in fact, they sued for the right to be white. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they lost. The Japanese were the next to file, and they also lost because it said that they were not Caucasian. So then Asian Indians filed for the right to be citizens, and they were like, too bad for the Japanese, but we are Caucasian. That was the race that was listed for them. And some of them did win their cases. However, in 1920, the Supreme Court finally put a ruling down that Asian Indians were not white either, so they also could not become citizens. I was telling a couple people here that my father came to this country in 1920. At that time, women were not allowed. He actually came to Seattle, so that's why you had all the bachelor societies in Chinatown. And he was not allowed to become a citizen until 1952. So even when communities of color are able to gain some assets, we have some strong examples about how those assets are taken away from them. So we had internment in the 1940s, where families had to leave their property within a week, and that property was lost to them. And of course, this went on in other communities as well, Tulsa, Oklahoma, where you had the Black Wall Street and thriving banks and other businesses that were burned down, and nobody was ever paid any compensation for that. The Japanese were given reparations of $20,000, but that's not nearly the amount of money that was lost. So the point is that for each of these groups that are not of European origin, the mechanisms might be a little bit different, but the result is the same, that you had people who were denied the opportunity to gain wealth. Now, for white families, what is the story? Again, you know, with J. Paul Getty, he talked about how hard he worked, and he did talk about his father leaving him the oil business and finding oil and so on. But there were many points, in fact, in every generation, the U.S. government has given benefits and boosts to white families. So at the same time that the Indian Wars were being fought and Native Americans were being dispossessed of their land, that land at the same time was being handed over to homesteaders from Europe in the Homesteading Act of 1865, I believe it was. But you could get 60-some acres of free land, and many people are still benefiting from their ancestors having that land. Just to jump forward a bit, Social Security, which we all think of as a wonderful benefit to actually not just older people, but to children as well, because there are survivors' benefits. But when Social Security was first put into place, two professions were left out: agricultural workers and domestic workers, and those were the two occupations that were held by African Americans and Latinos. So it was another whole generation before they got folded into the Social Security benefit program. The Federal Housing Administration, again, low interest subsidized loans for home ownership. Many people benefited from those programs from the 30s on, and also veterans mortgage programs. But out of all of the loans made by the Federal Housing Administration, only 2% went to people of color. And you all know about redlining. That was a governmental idea that certain neighborhoods that were populated by people of color were too risky to invest in, supposedly, and therefore they were not supposed to get those loans. The GI Bill. Now, again, here's where we have to be careful of universal policies. The GI Bill was a universal policy in that any GI was supposed to be able to go to school or get that low-interest home mortgage. However, at that time, in the 40s, many colleges still did not allow blacks especially to enter those colleges. So the applications for the historically black colleges were tremendous, but they couldn't take them all in, and the white colleges wouldn't admit them either. If you applied for a mortgage and the bank wouldn't take the mortgage, even though you had a right to it, you couldn't act on that right because of discrimination. So again, when we look at these policies, we have to be careful as to what the actual results are. And for people of color, you see these blocks at every point in history. So really, if you look at our parents and our grandparents and our ancestors, as we say about our children, they all wanted the same thing too. They wanted the same thing for their children that we now want for our own children, and they were willing to do the same things we do, work hard, sacrifice, so that they will have a better future. But while some were getting that boost from the government escalator, others were just running on the treadmill. So if you look at the wealth of different groups in the United States today, you can see that African Americans have the least amount of wealth at about $5,000 compared to $110,000 of the median white family. Now these figures are at the median, so if you took everybody and you lined them up by the lowest wealth to the highest wealth and took that family right in the middle, because we don't want it to be skewed by Bill Gates or Oprah Winfrey. So the median is that family right smack in the middle. And you can see that the typical African American family has not even a nickel compared to the dollar of wealth that a white family has. So think of the difference there. What can you do with that extra $95,000 or whatever? You know, you can buy the nice home. You can really get your kids well situated for a head start. But for $5,000, there's not nearly as much as you can do. Now, you'll note, too, that the income gap right now is about 60 cents to the dollar. But the wealth gap is so much greater. The wealth gap is the biggest gap that we see in terms of racial disparities today. And unfortunately, this is not just a result of past history. I was going to say that that if you look at those, that escalator and that treadmill, many white families think, well, we are where we are only because we did work so hard. But what they're not realizing is that they were born on third base and that it's easier to slide home when you already have assets. And in fact, inheritance is the main way that people get wealthy today. It is the way that race and class privilege is passed on. So over the last 25 years, unfortunately, the wealth gap has not decreased. It has increased. So while the income gap has started to narrow a little bit, maybe partly due to some of the employment policies of the civil rights era, the wealth gap has increased. And this more recent gap partly has to do with the housing meltdown, and we all know that families of color were much more likely to be steered to a high-interest loan than white families. So the issue for those of you who are advocates for children is that these wealth disparities correlate to academic achievement. This just shows that the median wealth of single parents under the age of 18, some single mothers and fathers have absolutely no wealth at all. If you need $15 to go on a school field trip, you got to beg, borrow, and steal in order to get that. But Trina Shanks at the University of Michigan found that child cognitive skills start to go on those diverging pathways even as young as 9 months. And there have been a number of studies that have shown that if you hold income constant, school achievement rates will still show racial disparities. But if you hold wealth constant, they will not. The racial disparities will disappear. So I'm just hoping that you will take a look at wealth and not just income as you're looking at policies for kids. Now, you have been fighting for racial equity for some time, and you are so forward thinking in that way. And there has always been a moral imperative for racial equity. But today there is a demographic imperative as well, because as we can see, as you know, right now the majority of babies born are already non-white. So in 10 years, the majority of children will be not white. So we can no longer ignore this. There is a demographic imperative. There's also an economic imperative. There was, again, a study was done that showed that if the race gap had closed in 1998, by 2008, the gross domestic product of our country would have been $525 billion more. So again, as you know, our future depends on racial equity in a really concrete way. So the good news, though, is that if policies were the thing that created this disparity and these problems, policies are the thing that can fix it. So we can take control of the levers. It's not rocket science. And that is what you're doing. So just really quickly, a couple of ideas for kids. One is a wealth account for every child. This has been an idea that was tried in England. At birth, every child would be given like a child trust fund, so we could put a silver spoon in every child's mouth. And you're already talking about universal quality early education for all. And even President Obama has put it in the federal budget, but we hope if states can implement it, then it will start to spread across the country. There's no reason why we can't have full employment, and that would be one of the only ways to close the unemployment gap. And how would we pay for it? Well, we certainly can use our tax code to help pay for it. Right now, for example, the home mortgage interest deduction, mostly for people who have, high-cost homes, that totals $70 billion, and we only spend $24.5 billion on low-income people, on various subsidies for them. So the other thing about looking at policies is make sure that the policy you're looking at doesn't just change behaviors, but it changes lives. So here's the social worker saying, here are job openings, some rental units, and a list of eligible bachelors. Well, I know that when I got divorced, the last thing in the world I needed was to find another guy to hang around the house. So the important thing for children is that we have caring adults in their lives, whether they be parents, whether they be grandparents, whether they be teachers, coaches, whatever. So so let's make sure that happens. So, you pride yourself, and rightly so, by asking, does this policy help kids? And that's a great number one question. But the second question you need to ask is, does it promote racial equity for kids? And I know that's on your radar screen. So at the end of the day, your policies should have this type of result. These are high school graduation rates, and this is the good news, that not only is it going up for every single group, white included, but you see a narrowing gap between all of the groups, so that hopefully those pathways and that line will all merge sometime in the very near future. And so what this will require is targeted spending, and there's nothing wrong with targets. I call this the any sane mother criteria. If you have 2 children or several children and one of them has special needs, you're going to put more time, attention, and resources into the one that needs it the most, and that's just common sense. So, last but not least is troublemaking. I went to a conference on racial equity among social workers, and they were talking about how social workers need to get back to the basics of community organizing, which was part of their profession for many, many years. And that means involving the community. I heard about a school district that had a big influx of Hmong people into their community, and they wanted to get the parents involved, so they said to them, join the PTA and help us run the school. And they were like, I don't think so, that's your job. And so they said, well, how about parenting classes? We could help you become better parents. And they're like, we think our kids are better behaved than the other kids we see in school. I don't think we need that. So finally they said, well, what is it that you would like? And they said, could you teach us how to bake cookies? So it turned out that when their kids were asked to bring cookies to school, they felt very isolated socially because they didn't know what that was all about. So that was the start. They taught them how to make cookies, and then they were off and running. So I just wanted to end by saying that it is great to be here among you people who I see as futurists. You are interested in the future because our children are our future, and as has been said, not just our own children, but every child in the state, every child in the nation. And you are also a futurist in that you recognize that our future will involve a much greater proportion of children of color, and you are dedicated to, right now, figuring out how to make sure that we are all on the same pathways and not diverging pathways. So keep on keeping on. You're doing a great job. You're really a model to the rest of the country, and many of us have heard about you in other states, and onward to full equality. Thank you very much.